Hello, my name is Paulette Luftig. Welcome to my talk, Finding Your Edge in a Culture of Feedback. I'm not used to standing at a podium, so I have to be careful here to stick really close to my screen. I'm a software engineer at a company called MavenLink here in San Francisco. We have our R&D departments. We have our main office in Irvine, California. We also have an engineering spot in Salt Lake City, Utah. In my previous career, I actually was in social work, and I was a yoga teacher full-time for a few years, owning my own studio. So I come from a coaching background as well, and at my company, in addition to doing software engineering, I'm also a coach. So I really love getting into ideas around feedback and building culture. If you're interested in accessing the slides online, you can go to bit.ly/ForwardJS Feedback Edge Slides. And I did put together a survey for this talk in the spirit of giving feedback. I thought I would broaden my culture of feedback by including the people who are watching the talk and give you an opportunity to practice some of the things that I'm going to share with you today. Here's a screenshot of my company's website. And if you want to know more about MavenLink, we have this awesome blog post at mavenlink.com/engineering. And it talks a lot more about more than just the engineering department, a lot about product and design and the corporate team as well. So today I want to go through a few different topics. Mainly I want to get you thinking about your own relationship to feedback and your own kind of developmental edge. And we'll start by looking at why a culture of feedback is valuable, what it is. I'll talk about what an edge is in a culture of feedback, your own personal edge, and then go into some of the nuts and bolts, and this is the bulk of the slide presentation, about how to give and how to receive feedback effectively. So what is a culture of feedback? Why is it valuable? And let's talk about a few definitions first. And if you think about culture, organizational culture, we have these shared systems and beliefs that we end up transmitting over time amongst our group of people. And so we end up showing up and behaving in particular ways based on what we're all sort of agreeing is the norm. And then feedback, my preferred definition is skillful communication, really skillful communication designed for some developmental purpose for the team or the organization or the person we're speaking to. And if we put these two things together, I like to think of a really proactive culture where we're like getting into it and provoking one another to improve, to grow, and then in turn growing our teams and our organization overall. And typically we do this through practice. Some of the reasons why culture of feedback, I think, is really valuable. First one is that in a culture like this, everybody really matters. It's not that everybody doesn't matter in any other organizational culture. It's that it's just more, we bring it more into our awareness in a culture of feedback. We start to think about how we're influencing the person sitting beside us, or the team that we're on, or the department in general, in a much broader way. It sort of becomes more of a part of the daily practice. And a culture of feedback is intended to promote growth in many, many ways. And I'm not speaking specifically to the growth of profit of an organization or the number of people. I'm thinking more about how we grow our muscles of capability. So as an individual, and then as a team, and so on. And the great byproduct of that often is that we do grow our companies in the best ways. And this is a concept you've probably heard of before. It's pretty popular right now, this concept of the growth mindset. A culture of feedback has this at its core. You have to have a growth mindset to really become vulnerable and start showing your imperfections and being willing to work on the things that we could improve from day to day with people at our office. So growth mindset was a concept created or discussed and discovered and researched by a woman named Carol Dweck. She's a Stanford psychologist. And she basically showed that when a person believes that they have the ability to change their intellectual capabilities, they actually are more likely to be effective and successful when faced with the same challenge as somebody who actually believes that our capabilities are fixed, they're static. So in a culture of feedback, we're encouraging people to really persist in the face of setbacks. People who really believe their talents are innate, they tend to give up more easily because they don't believe that they can change. And people who have a growth mindset, they look at criticism as an opportunity to keep learning and growing. So it's a really valuable thing to get criticism. And then for many of us who are already working in the tech world and using XP or agile business environments, a culture of feedback is really similar to what we're already doing. We're developing, testing, getting feedback, and iterating again and again until we get it right, and that's all we do as well when we're working in a culture of feedback on ourselves. So what does this all really mean in practice? And honestly, that depends on kind of how you approach it. If you're someone who sees their imperfections as a reason to kind of put their head in the sand, to hide, to sort of disconnect from people, then you're going to feel really alone and kind of in a stark place compared to someone who approaches being vulnerable fearlessly and becomes willing to share those imperfections with other people. I'll end this section with a quote from Brené Brown, who she gave a TED Talk called The Power of Vulnerability, which is one of the most top 5 TED Talks of all time, watched TED Talks of all time. And she says, imperfections are not inadequacies. They are reminders that we are all in this together because honestly, we're all imperfect. And the more that we can become willing to share those imperfections, the more of our true selves can come out and participate in our workplace. So what does it mean to find your own personal edge in a culture of feedback? And it depends on who you are. I think some people are a bit more cerebral, and some of us are more connected to our emotional body of experience. And so I thought I'd offer 2 kind of takes on this. And the first is for people who want to be in their head and need to really analyze and get into things, I thought I'd start with a few questions for you to consider asking yourself or asking people around you. Where do you notice that you stop trying? There are clues in these questions to start you thinking about where your edges might be. For me, I notice I can stop trying if I bump up against something that's intellectually really challenging and somebody is witnessing my experience as I roll through that. Where do your thoughts turn self-defeating? This is to me, a pretty key indicator that I'm experiencing an edge. And what conversations are you not having? So if you're typically someone who's pretty chatty, and you notice at some point in conversation, you just step out and you don't disconnect from the people around you, there's probably an edge in here for you to be working. But if you are more like me, and the emotional body of experience is where you become more connected to your edges, you might end up feeling something like this. And I love this image because it's how I feel a lot when I'm actually experiencing myself watching something that I would rather be, and I don't exactly experience myself as that just yet. I have this experience of being disconnected other than the thing that I want to be. And so if you take this want to be a horse person, she's obviously longing for something that she feels separated from, something that she wants to be that's out there in the pasture. It's obviously much more real, much more tangible. And if this person wants to become a horse, well, she's got some pretty serious obstacles to overcome. I mean, the first thing is probably people are not going to believe that she can become a horse, right? And they're going to tell her it's not possible. She's going to have to get over that, and people telling her not to try it. She's going to have to get over the fact that if she tries and she fails, some people are going to gloat. They're going to probably make fun of her a little bit. But then she also has to consider the real challenges of what it takes to transform herself into a horse. So it's likely going to be pretty painful to change this body into another body. It's going to take some skill development because communicating from the body of a horse is going to be really different from communicating from the body of a human. And so there are all these things you need to question over time. Is it really worth what you get on the other side? I mean, maybe she gets to gallop off into the sunset, but she's not going to be able to communicate in the same way. So you have to consider all of the pieces. So let's look at this for people who are more connected to their emotions, this chart here. Some experience acts as a trigger to provoke emotional responses. So for me, one of these experiences has been typically watching people present. Over the years, I tended to avoid opportunities to present. I was terrified of it. And I, at the same time, had this extreme experience of envying. I really wanted to be able to get up there and present in front of a bunch of people like I'm doing right now. But I still felt really separate from all the people who were doing it. I kind of othered myself. They're the ones who can. I'm the one who can't. But over time, I had this community of feedback at my office the last few years who were like, we know you can do it, and they just kept encouraging me to get up and start speaking. So over time, I developed these skills, and I transformed those negative emotions into their more positive qualities, their adjacent qualities. So instead of avoiding things, I decided to accept starting where I am. If I failed the first time, and I remember practicing for this even, and I forgot half of what I was going to share, just a matter of practice. I noticed that every time I feel envy now, it's a huge sign for me that I need to get into action, because envy just means I want something. I want something that somebody else has. And I can get it if I work on it. And then I feel less separate because now I can connect with the people I see doing it and use them as allies to help me grow my skills. And then fear, I still feel pretty afraid when I get up here and talk in front of people, but it's definitely not something that stops me any longer. So here I am at ForwardJS, and I tend to tackle presenting kind of like a fearless space jumper now. Like I get out there and I just do it, but I do know that I have a ton of support. I have it from my community at work, and I have it from people here in the audience who I'm sure just want to see people who get up and present do a good job. So I used to approach presenting like this. It felt like my edge was just going to take me to my death. Anywhere I turned, I would fall to peril. But if working our edges at our offices or in our communities has the potential of feeling exhilarating like this, then why don't we do it more often? And the answer to this question is pretty complex, but I think the heart of it is that in most of our organizations, it really doesn't feel safe enough to explore our deepest edges. And I read this great book called In Everyone Culture, Becoming a Deliberately Developmental Organization. I'll say DDO from now on. They say that in a typical organization, individuals hide parts of themselves, avoid conflict, unwittingly sabotage change efforts, and subtly enforce a separation between the me at work and the real me. So it's like we come to work always wearing a mask. We've always got to look and be our best all the time, and it's honestly so exhausting. And the authors of this, they're Harvard psychologists and educators, actually, at Harvard. 5 of them who wrote this book. They go as far to say that in a typical organization, everyone's doing a second job that no one's getting paid to do. Look good, stay safe, and avoid being vulnerable. But what if we were all more like DDOs? What if our companies were there to support employees to close that gap between who they are at work and who they really are? And what if they actually saw that our weaknesses were actually potential assets? If we can uncover where we're not strong, then we can work on it. We can become more of an asset to our organization. And every time we make a mistake, they just see that as an opportunity to help us fill in the gaps. I think we would live our lives a hell of a lot more fulfilled because we spend so much of our time at our organizations doing our jobs. So how do we create this culture of feedback? What do we do to make sure we're giving and receiving feedback well on a daily basis? And one of the things we need to do is actually learn how to structure feedback and give it to the people around us consistently and done well. So first, let's talk about how we want to structure feedback. The easiest way to do this is remembering the ASK acronym. We want to make sure that feedback is actionable, specific, and that it is kind. So when I talk about actionable feedback, we want to make sure it's about something the recipient has the ability to change. If we're giving them feedback that we don't like the color of their eyes, it's probably pretty useless. And we want to make sure that we explain what the recipient is being asked to do differently. With specific feedback, we want to make sure we're focusing on the impact, not the action, the action over the person. I think of a child who's coloring on walls. You would say that the action of drawing is bad to do, not the child. The child's not bad. And we want to state what's happened that was done well or not well. And I should say also before I go any further that when I talk about feedback, I'm mostly thinking about constructive feedback here, but positive feedback and instructive feedback are also very important to keep in mind. And I think we should be giving more positive feedback than we do constructive feedback, but I think people tend to have a harder time giving constructive feedback than positive feedback. But when I say you want to state what happened that was done well or not well, I'm referring to looking at what was observed, not what you inferred. So you might have an idea about what somebody was thinking or feeling or intending when they did something, but really, if you're going to bring those things up, you want to make sure that you're checking your assumptions with them before you go too far. It can get you into some deep water. And so when you use feedback, you make sure you talk about what you observed happening. And you want to avoid absolute language, like always and never. You tend to tell little lies when you use these words because it's hard to be accurate when you're using them. And then feedback should be kind, so discreet when appropriate. If you want to give praise, probably do it in public. If you want to give constructive feedback, try to do it in a space that person receiving it's going to feel safe and able to process how they respond emotionally. You want to make sure that you're moving into that conversation with positive intentions. if you are someone who has like some secret ill will for the person you're giving feedback to, you're probably the wrong person to be giving it. And you want to make sure that your feedback is actually intended to help that person grow and change. And it's timely. So best to give feedback as close to when it happens as possible. And empathetic. Can you get into or think about before you step into that conversation what it will be like for that person, as best you can, to hear what you're about to share. And if you can be with that person and let them process that experience, that's going to be a lot better. And unassuming. So I already mentioned, if you're going to bring up things that you think, you have assumptions about things, make sure you're checking them and try to avoid making big assumptions when you go into the conversation. So there is a caveat about kindness in relation to feedback, and that's that it's a really terrible reason not to give feedback. Some people will sort of steer away from giving people feedback because they're afraid they're going to upset somebody. And I actually want to see people raise their hands. Like, how many of you here actually find it pretty difficult to step into a conversation and give constructive feedback? So you assume that maybe that person's going to have a hard response when they hear. Can you just raise your hands for me? Yeah. How many of you actually love getting constructive feedback? So it's really useful to you, and yeah. I mean, it's about the same. So it's when we love getting feedback, but nobody really wants to give it, it's hard to create that cycle. So here's a great quadrant map. This is created by a woman named Kim Scott. She has an organization called candor.org. It's pretty cool. And Kim really advocates for us starting to drop the filters because we tend to, out of political, like being polite, we tend to filter out what we're saying so much. In the top, I'll just draw your attention to the axes here, the caring personally and the challenging directly. On the vertical scale, we have caring personally, on the horizontal, challenging directly. And ruinous empathy falls on the high of care, but really low and challenge. And so if you think about it, if we don't give people feedback that they need, that can actually be ruinous to somebody's career. Where you want to land is in the upper right quadrant, which is really high in the care and really high in the challenge, called radical candor. And I'll tell you a quick story about Kim Scott and Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook. They were at an executive meeting at Google, I think, and they left the meeting. Kim was presenting, and Sheryl and Kim are good friends. They were talking and walking out, and they were going on about how well the presentation went and how well it was received. And Sheryl said, "Yes, Kim, but you know what? You said a lot through the presentation." And Kim just kind of brushed it off. Yeah, that's okay. I get really nervous sometimes, and I say a lot. But it was received well, so it doesn't matter. And Sheryl repeated herself and said, "No, you said a lot." And Kim once again brushed it off and kind of went back to the fact that the presentation overall was received well. And Sheryl was like, had to stop her kind of in the tracks and say, "No, like, I don't think you're hearing me. When you say a lot, you sound stupid." And this was very forthcoming from Sheryl, and Kim says that it really provoked her to stop and think and change her behavior. So in relationships where you have a good connection, you can venture into this land of using radical candor, and it can be very helpful to people. On the bottom right, we have something called obnoxious aggression. So it's high in challenge but low in care. And that's with people who sometimes don't have all the skills to be giving great feedback, but they do it anyway. And Kim Scott says if you can't offer radical candor, the second best thing you can do is be an asshole. And honestly, it's probably better to get the feedback, even if it's not perfectly framed, than to not get it at all. Because then you end up with this experience of possibly ruinous empathy. And just for time's sake, I'm not going to go into the fourth quadrant, but I hope you read Radical Candor, The Surprising Secret to Being a Good Boss. It's a great article, and Kim Scott's organization is pretty great. So giving feedback that is actionable, specific, and kind is a really great start to giving awesome feedback, but it isn't enough if you want to ensure you don't end up doing something like this. And I love this image because it makes me think of somebody who's giving feedback, but they haven't really checked in with themselves and how to do it, and they're kind of vomiting out their experience and their emotions all over the person who they're trying to give feedback to. So giving great feedback really requires that you start by asking yourself a few really important questions. So is now the right time? So did you set it up? Were you careful about aligning yourself with that person? You brought them into a meeting instead of pulling them out of a deadline experience where they're working with colleagues. Make sure that you choose your time wisely and that you are grounded, and the person who you're going to be speaking to is also grounded. If there's name calling, if there's yelling, if emotions are hot, you really should wait. Hold off from giving feedback until people are back on the ground emotionally. Am I aware of my personal values, privileges, and biases? And I think this is a really important question at this point in time. There's a ton of implicit bias that we're all carrying. And it's important that we do our own investigation, spend time learning about ourselves, understanding where we might end up doing things that are racist or ageist or ableist, all the isms, so to speak. It takes some time and some consistency to know these things. But if we're going into a feedback conversation, we should really be checking in with ourselves to make sure that we're not going to be following any of these kind of ugly norms that we see in our culture today. And there's a video that I've referenced down at the bottom, The Career Advice You Probably Didn't Get by Susan Collins-Tuano. She's on TED. And she talks about some gender norms that happen, or some gender issues that happen up in the highest executive teams around mentoring, and the differences that can happen between men and women in mentoring in upper executive teams. And then am I in a position of power, and can I use it wisely? And I'll tell you a quick story about my experience in my previous career that woke me up to this question. I was running a home for young single moms. There were 8 women and 8 children at any given time, and I was a counselor and social worker there. And one night we were all going out to an event, and one of the young women was not yet in the van, so we had this huge van ready to go out to this event, and she was still upstairs with her child, her baby. And so I had to turn the van off and go upstairs, knock on her door. And I was feeling pretty annoyed and aggravated by the situation. We were running late, and she came to the door very apologetic, and it was common for her to be late. She kept saying, I'm so sorry, I know I'm late. And I said something to the effect of, like, you better get your shit together and get down here. It was kind of an aggressive way to talk. And a few days later, my supervisor came to me to give me some feedback about how I communicated with this young woman. And what I didn't really get in that moment was the power I had over her in her life. I had the power to have her evicted from this program that she was doing very well in. I had the power to make a phone call to the ministry and have her child removed from her care. I really didn't think about it enough before I came and spoke to her. So it's really important that we understand our positions of power and how they influence how people relate to us in our organizations. And am I willing to have a conversation? Well, when I got the feedback from my supervisor, she invited me into a conversation about what to do about it. I had made this mistake. I didn't communicate well to this young woman. And I was asked how I would make it right. So we came up with the idea of me studying nonviolent communication. And then not only that, using nonviolent communication at my job. And then not only that, actually creating a program that I taught to allow me to teach it to the women that I worked with throughout the days. And then, can you respond with empathy and not sympathy? And this is also this is an image from a teaching video by Brené Brown called Brené Brown on Empathy, where she really clearly helps us understand the difference between using empathy and sympathy. And sympathy, to me, is when we're trying to get away from our own discomfort of other people's uncomfortable emotions. So we're in a conversation with somebody, they share something that was really hard, and we say, oh yeah, but you still have this, right? You're still okay with this. We're trying to move them out of their discomfort so that we feel more comfortable. Whereas when we're giving them empathy, we're like, oh, that's really shitty, and I think I know how that feels, and I can hang out with you here for a little while. I'm really sorry this is happening for you. And so if we're good at being with people and using empathy, it's going to go a lot farther in our feedback conversations than sympathy. So once our conversations are over, we want to check in after the fact. And if we've offered any kind of support, be your word. Show up for them. Hopefully we'll end up avoiding doing any of these things. So now that we understand how to give feedback, let's consider it from the opposite side of the equation. How do we receive feedback well? Because each of us has our own kind of personal slant on giving and receiving feedback. Some of us are great at giving it, but we have a really hard time receiving feedback from other people. So I want to start off with a quote from Brené Brown: "Healthy striving is self-focused. How can I improve? And perfectionism is other-focused. What will they think?" So as soon as you know someone's going to give you feedback or you're receiving feedback, can you get into that mindset of, okay, how can I use this feedback to help me improve? So what we have to do is be able to relax that unhelpful perfectionist mindset of thinking about what other people are thinking of us. And we need to choose a growth mindset over a fixed mindset. So I've already gone into this, but it's really hard to grow and receive feedback if we believe that our talent is just innate, it's fixed. But if we can relax that and start to think, okay, I can just take small steps, one step at a time, you'll actually make change. It's going to take you a lot further, a lot faster. And we need to see feedback as an opportunity to grow with help from other people, mainly because we're going to come up with way better ideas about how to grow and change if we have other people working with us and collaborating with us to do that. So cultures of feedbacks are amazing because when I was learning this talk, for example, I gave everybody signs and I asked them to hold them up for me. You know, if I'm breathing, if I'm not breathing, remind me to breathe. If I'm speaking too quickly, that kind of thing. It's like this constant feedback loop of ideas about how to do better. And we need to stop playing defense. So this can be passive or active. And the most obvious form of defensiveness is, physical aggressiveness. You can use verbal aggressiveness. You can be quite vocally mean. But there's also the more subtle form of defensiveness, so passive aggression, subtle sly comments that are demeaning, or stonewalling. So internally, you're not present for somebody. You're like, they're talking, but you're not actually listening, not using eye contact, not being present. Those are other ways of kind of defending against receiving feedback that could be useful to you. And you have to be aware of your experience to be able to do this. And I bring this up because I've had a bit of time now in my life where I've tried to understand the internal workings of my brain and my emotions, and I have had to learn how to still myself, to get still, to really start to understand what's happening inwardly. Sometimes I can trick myself into believing I'm thinking or doing better than I am when I receive feedback, and so I have to slow down and start to listen really carefully to know what's going on. And you have to have compassion for yourself and for other people. Because honestly, when people give feedback, they're not always going to do it perfectly. You know, we're all practicing, we're all learning in a culture of feedback how to do it regularly, consistently, not hurt our feelings. You know, we're all working at it. So if we can be compassionate to the people who are trying to provide us feedback, that'll be helpful. And we also have to be compassionate to ourselves. You know, if we make a mistake, if we get fired, if we, all these things, we have to remember to turn that stream of compassion within. And my Buddhist teacher used to point to a statue of Kuan Yin, a Chinese goddess who's got this an urn of water turned upside down. And so I love this image. I carry it with me. So generally speaking, we have to take also what works but leave the rest, because I think sometimes people give us feedback that doesn't resonate. And it'll happen from time to time. As much as you try, it just doesn't really seem to represent you or speak to you in some way. And sometimes that's because it's a projection, it's coming from somebody, and they're seeing through their particular lens, and it really is more about them than about you. And so as you tune in more and get more practice with receiving and giving feedback, you'll notice when that's happening. But always with kind of this expression of gratitude that people are trying in a culture of feedback, it'll take you pretty far. So thank you very much for letting me share my ideas around feedback. I do have a slide here with all the resources I've used, and I encourage you, there are some really great resources here. Not the coaching manuals, they're not as easy to get access to, but all the other books are excellent. The Giving Effective Feedback is very quick read, and it's really helpful. And then again, if you feel like practicing some feedback right away, please fill out my survey, bit.ly give edge feedback survey. Or visit us on mavenlink.com/engineering to learn more about MavenLink. We, of course, are always hiring in lots of different departments. So thank you so much for your time today.